Covering the Arab Spring is no picnic. Next on Global Perspectives, we'll talk to someone who's living through it.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida.
The political upheaval in many countries of North Africa and the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, may well be the story of 2011 and beyond. Regimes that have been in place for decades are being replaced, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. It is an uncertain and dangerous time in a critical area, one where U.S. interests, while not always clear, are consistently serious and significant. It is also an uncertain and dangerous time for journalists, including today's guest, who bring us the stories of these changes. Anthony Shadid, a Pulitzer Prize winner for the New York Times and the newspaper's Beirut bureau chief, comes to us from the streets of Libya and other trouble spots. His insights will help us expand our understanding of what the Arab Spring means for the region, the United States, and the world. Welcome to our show, Mr. Shadid. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure's mine.
Tell us how the so-called Arab Spring started for you. When did you first end up in one of these systems, countries where things were changing?
You know, I've been covering Baghdad I'd been there for about, I guess, the last rotation for about a year and a half, and I was covering the return of Muqtada Sadr to Iraq when Tunisia exploded. I wasn't able to get out of Baghdad in time, but I got back to Beirut pretty soon after, and that's when the Egyptian revolution started gathering force. And I think it was one of the most uncomfortable nights I ever spent, not being able to get a plane into Cairo when the protests had really gathered momentum, and I was able to get in the next morning. And I have to say, in hindsight, it was the most remarkable story I've ever covered in 15 years of reporting.
Give us just a glimpse into what you might have experienced on a particular day in terms of the tensions, the violence, maybe the sense of danger that you had.
You know, I never really felt all that much danger in Egypt. I know a lot was made of that period for some journalists, that they did run into some harassment and intimidation. There's no doubt that the Egyptian government, the old Egyptian government, did use what they call boltagia, these pretty much paid thugs to try to enforce their own policies. That was a danger there. What I was so struck by in Egypt was the community, or the scene, let's say, that unfolded in Tahrir Square, in that downtown square. And I remember at one point I just kind of wanted to try to capture what that moment meant for the newspaper, and I ended up spending the night there. And I have to say, I think a lot of this, what's going on with these Arab revolts or Arab revolution, and are these changing notions of community, of identity, of sense of self, of sense of country. And it really struck me in Tahrir Square that night of how, like, people were, for the first time, I think, in a generation, imagining what they wanted their country to be. And that was, I think, in a large part what the revolution was all about.
Do you have a clearer sense of where all of this is headed now, or is it still very, very murky?
You know, I really have no idea, to be honest. And there was a famous academic used to teach at the American University in Beirut, and he said, I'm no longer going to write about Arab politics. This was back in, I think, 1970, 1971. I'm no longer going to write about Arab politics because they're boring. The one thing you can say now is Arab politics are anything but boring. I mean, everything seems to be in play. We're dealing with 3 revolutions, 3 uprisings that haven't ended yet. The map of the Middle East has already been rewritten. Where it's headed, I don't know. The only thing I feel somewhat certain about is that this is going to be a years-long process. It's going to be, some of these countries are going to fall in between utter crackdown and sweeping revolution. I think we're already seeing that perhaps in Bahrain, how that unfolds there. It's going to be a very, I think, dangerous period for the United States to navigate. First and foremost, because U.S. intervention is probably always going to go wrong at some level. But I think it's also in the long term, and I think it's going to be a very tough short term and medium term, perhaps very violent. But I think the long term, we're also talking about a more stable region in the end, a region that has governments that reflect the sentiments of their people, and that's been a rarity in the Arab world.
I think that was actually where I was going to go next. A lot of us have this tendency to sort of compartmentalize and apply labels and try to predict exactly what's going to happen, and we obviously can't do that in this case. But I think some have been inspired by ideas of democracy, for example. And is this necessarily leading in a democratic direction? You said something about reflecting people's wishes and intentions, but is that necessarily democracy?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. I mean, I think we are headed toward a much more democratic order. One, because we couldn't have any less democratic order than we've had over the past generation. Everything from Saudi Arabia and Egypt, very important United States allies, to countries like, Syria, for instance, one of the most authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. I think there is an irreversible movement toward more democratic orders. How we get there, what happens along the way, do civil wars happen along the way? I think these are all very possible, but I think that momentum is irreversible. I do worry about some of the broader struggles at play, though, and I think that's less. I think the question becomes less: are we going to have a democratic states or not democratic states, but rather what kind of states are going to be built, what kind of communities are going to be built. And I think one of the main struggles underway in these Arab revolts is smaller identities and larger identities. Do we see ourselves as citizens in a large sense, or do we see ourselves as Sunni Muslims or Shiite Muslims or Kurds, or the list goes on. Do we see ourselves in terms of smaller identities? And I think which way that struggle goes is going to determine a lot how healthy or how vibrant these democracies become.
Tell us about Syria. I think initially in Syria people were hopeful that there would be another Arab Spring type experience, but the response of the government has been exceedingly violent. We have thousands who have been killed or injured in this, and yet people keep coming back to the streets, almost as if they've decided this is the point of no return and they have to either do it today or never. Do you have a feeling about that situation? Do you think the people will actually prevail at some point in Syria, or is this going to continue to be just a bloody civil conflict for some time to come?
I think they will eventually prevail in Syria. Syria, more than any other country in the region, worries me, though. The potential for regional intervention, potential for war, be it with Israel or a civil war itself within Syria. Turkey is on the borders with great interest in Syria, Iran, obviously. The United States, for that matter, Saudi Arabia as well. So I think that there's a very combustible environment in which this uprising is taking place in Syria. But I have to say I've been struck by the resilience of the protesters, to their determination, and three, the inability of the government to understand what it's dealing with. It's almost utter ignorance. It's striking at times, in fact. You watch President Bashar al-Assad get on TV and talk about setting up a committee to deliberate the possibility of an eventual political parties law. It's just so far removed from the situation on the ground. How long those protests take to bring about change, I think, is almost impossible to say. But there is, again, that momentum that I talked about earlier with this kind of shift toward more democratic orders. You absolutely see that in Syria, and the situation as it is not tenable. One thing I think I've just in reporting on that story that I can say with clarity, though, is that, again, this battle of smaller identities and larger identities is very much at play in Syria. And the thing I do worry about there is that the longer the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, stays in power, the less chance that country has to make a peaceful transition. In other words, he's the most dangerous. I think he's the biggest danger to the country at this point.
So there'll be a transition, but not necessarily a peaceful one.
That's right.
And it seems that the population as a whole has finally broken through the barrier of fear. And once that happens, then, like you said, if the government fails to understand the situation, it could be a very, very terrible outcome.
Well, they have broken through that fear everywhere except Damascus and Aleppo. And of course, Damascus and Aleppo would be the two largest cities in Syria. They haven't moved yet. There have been sporadic protests there. Aleppo, it's unclear. It's been favored recently by the government, not historically, but recently it's been favored by the government. Damascus, of course, is the prestige of the government. Therefore, you have massive security forces keeping a clamp on it. The kind of common wisdom out there is unless Damascus and Aleppo move, the uprising can't succeed. I think that argument makes a lot of sense, but you are seeing growing signs of cleavages, of growing frustration in those cities. It's not a stalemate. It's very much a dynamic and a fluid situation.
Tell us about Iran. You mentioned Iran earlier, and it certainly is very, very concerned about maintaining the current system in place, and has said that if something were to happen to it, it would be disastrous for the stability of the region. What exactly does that mean? Would you see Iran potentially intervening in some way in Syria?
I think Iran already is intervening at some level. I think it's pretty clear that there has been a transfer of equipment, of technology to Syria. Of course, Iran dealt with its own protest movement after the elections there. They have some skill in being able to staunch these protests. So there has been, I think, that kind of intervention in terms of sending equipment, expertise perhaps. There have been rumors, and it's hard to confirm them, that the Iranians have also tried to bolster the Syrian currency, which has lost a little bit, but also a lot of money has been spent trying to stabilize it. The collapse of that currency, of course, could be one of the indicators of the fall of the regime. So I think we're seeing a lot of Iranian effort to keep Syria somewhat stable, but even with Iran, I think very remarkably, a week ago, did not criticize the Syrian government, but urged it to acknowledge the legitimate demands of the people there. Now that's in the kind of diplomatic speak, that's a remarkable statement for Iran to make. I think Iran is very nervous. In some ways, Syria is more important to Iran than the Syrian government. So how do we maintain this alliance? How do we maintain our foothold, our influence in Syria, which is really its entry point to the Arab world? I think that's occupying a lot of attention of Iranian officials right now.
You've been very high profile in the Libyan situation as well, and you've just come from there. Tell us what your experience has been from the beginning when you had some harrowing experiences.
I went to Libya soon after the Egyptian revolution, or soon after, let's say, President Mubarak fell. I think there was a lot of interest, obviously, in what was happening in Libya, but there was also some trepidation out there, I think, because already it had turned bloody. It had turned violent very quickly, in large part due to the Libyan government's response. They were shooting people in the streets, to the head often, with heavy, anti-aircraft weapons. I mean, it was a very brutal, gruesome scene. I went in there, and by the time I got into the east, it had already been liberated. The government had collapsed at that point. And I have to say, as a reporter, I was very struck by how these new systems of governance were emerging in a landscape that had been dominated by 42 years by Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. And when I say dominated by Colonel Gaddafi, I mean it incarnated all his eccentricities, his mercurial nature, his almost lack of a state, to be honest. I mean, it was very much arbitrary one-man rule. Across that landscape, new systems of governance were being built. So intellectually, as a reporter, it was fascinating to see this unfold. Within a week or two, though, I was covering the fighting that was going on, and colleagues of mine, there was 3 colleagues, and I got abducted or captured, or however you describe it, by Libyan troops, and we were held for about a week, and we were very lucky. Other colleagues got held for months and months, and we were able to get out after about a week by virtue of the intervention of Turkish diplomats, so we got lucky. I had not gone back until the fall of Colonel Gaddafi, or at least since he fled the capital. And it did strike me going back. I mean, the revolution has succeeded in a lot of respects. I mean, we could argue that Colonel Gaddafi could make trouble in the future, but the revolution in some ways has succeeded, has overthrown the regime. And I think you can make 2 arguments. One is that the revolution in Libya has the potential to be the most sweeping revolution of any. We're dealing with a state that has been obliterated. I mean, we're starting from the first chapter of what's going to emerge in that country. Nothing's really left. 2, it's uncanny how many resemblances you have to Iraq in 2003. Again, utter collapse of a state, a leader who's fled and is in hiding, foreign intervention, although the intervention obviously is dramatically different in the cases of Libya and Iraq, and also that sense of kind of ambiguity or the unknown of where's this all going to lead. I don't think anybody really knows in Libya the answer to that.
Help us connect as Americans watching this from thousands of miles away with what is important for us to understand. How does this affect us? We've seen ups and downs in oil prices, gas prices, but generally speaking, the average person here doesn't seem to have much of a connection to what's going on there, and yet there are many such connections.
I mean, I think it's interesting when you look at kind of the American-Arab relationship. I mean, one, it's a very intricate, involved relationship on almost every level: political, economic, military. Obviously, the United States has huge economic interests in the Middle East, given oil. It has strategic interests, given its alliance with Israel, and how I think in a lot of ways that's distorted its relationship with the Arab world. It also has, I think, a moral obligation, perhaps. The United States has fought, 2 wars there in the past 20 years. It's occupied a country there. It's bolstered an order that was singularly undemocratic by virtue of its support of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And it has I think the impact of that, the repercussions of that have led us to where we are today. I think you could look at 9/11, you could look at the growth of Al-Qaeda, you could look at the success of Islamists, and I think a lot of it has to do with the American engagement or American involvement or American interaction with the Arab world. So this is an incredibly important moment for the United States. I think for the first time in a long time, the United States has a chance to reorient its policies toward a region that has probably occupied more time of American diplomats than any other region, certainly since the Cold War. It's going to be tough. There's no question about that. It's going to be dangerous, but it's also the potential there to get it right this time, to reorient that relationship on a more solid footing, a more healthy footing. I think has the potential to. The United States has the opportunity to reap great rewards from that.
And do you see these changes happening in all countries to some extent, or sweeping the systems aside in all countries, or will some countries remain as they have been?
I think some governments are going to stay in power, but I think the reverberations are going to affect every government, absolutely. The kind of popular talk these days when you go to, like for instance in Beirut, is that Saudi Arabia is eventually going to have to deal with this as well. I think at this point the kind of forces for the counter-revolution, let's say, the antithesis of the Arab Spring is Israel and Saudi Arabia. They worry about the collapse of the order that has existed and that was supported by the United States. That order is collapsing now. And how it collapses, how it's reoriented, how it's rebuilt, again, is in a lot of respects what we're going to be focusing on in the years ahead. If Saudi Arabia were to be swept up in the throes of these Arab revolts, of these demands for reform and change, we're going to look at the most, perhaps the most important moment in the Arab world, in the Middle East, in centuries. I mean, it really is that sweeping and vast of what we're talking about.
How will all these changes affect some of the prominent peace treaties in the region and the relations between the Arab states and Israel, for example?
That's a great question. And I think we have to remember that these peace treaties were signed by governments that were not representative of their people's opinions, especially Egypt. I mean, Egypt remains overwhelmingly hostile toward Israel. The United States remains fundamentally unpopular in Egypt. Egyptian governments in the future are going to have to at least reflect popular sentiments. I think we're already seeing that. We saw that crisis that erupted in August between Egypt and Israel over the killing of Egyptian soldiers on the border with the Sinai Peninsula. This, I think, is going to be the norm moving forward. I think Israel is not going to be able to rely on the kind of tacit backing that it received from countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Jordan, absolutely, in past years. It's going to deal with more aggressive foreign policies. It's going to deal with more pressure from these countries to at least consider an agreement with the Palestinians. I think the fear out there, though, is that it may be too late in some respects. I think that part of the region is where you get most pessimistic. It's hard to see a way forward, I think, in terms of Arab-Israeli peacemaking. It is very easy to see a new era of Arab-Israeli tension.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, these are officially recognized international agreements, and if international law means anything in the world of today, these types of accords have to be upheld. Yeah. The principle of successor governments, whether they agree or disagree with their predecessors, abrogating treaties would be absolutely disastrous and a terrible precedent, not just for the Middle East, but for the world.
No one's going to abrogate those treaties. Those treaties are for eternity, absolutely. The Americans would never allow it, and they have enough strength and clout to stop those treaties from being abrogated. But I think that tension that will happen even as the treaties are still in place is going to make it a much messier situation. I mean, there was a lot of intervention going on with the United States in terms of Egypt and Israel in August over this crisis, and they were able to calm it down. The Americans still have a lot of influence with the Egyptian military. Is that always going to be the case? It's hard to say. And we've seen wars happen in the Middle East that started on the flimsiest of pretexts.
Going forward, what is your biggest concern? What is the main challenge that we face besides the uncertainty?
I think we're going to have to grapple with the ascent of a very powerful, well-articulated Islamist voice in the Arab world. And I think it's going to be very shocking and very surprising for many Americans to see the success of Islamist parties in Egypt in elections in November, in Tunisia in elections in October, the strength of Islamist opposition groups in Syria, for instance, maybe perhaps the most powerful opposition group within that country. There's going to be a reckoning between these old orders, well, let's say even these new orders, and how those new orders are going to incorporate Islamist voices, Islamist currents. without threatening the order itself. And that hasn't been answered yet in any country. I think Egypt is going to be the test case. I think in the long run, there's the potential for a healthier body politic. You know, Islamists have been forced out of the system for so long, and that has created a certain militancy, a radicalization of the Islamists themselves. But no one's actually tried to bring them in either, and that's the test ahead. And I think that's going to be a very dangerous test, and it's going to be a tough one for the United States to deal with as well, because their policies are going to affect how that process unfolds.
And how do you develop your strategy for dealing with this very, very fluid situation? Is it mostly reactive? Do you have a priority list of countries that you pay attention to, and do you immediately go in if it appears that things are going to erupt on a large scale?
I have to say, this year, and you're talking about me as a journalist, has been the toughest year I don't feel like I've had a day off since January. It's been remarkable. It has been mostly reactive. The only place that I feel like I was able to plot a little bit of the coverage was on Syria, because the Syrian story has unfolded for so long. Egypt was, Egypt was a revolution that took place in weeks, Tunisia as well. Bahrain and Yemen are difficult to get into. I went to Bahrain, but it's very difficult to get into. Syria, we've been covering it from Lebanon, but you've been able to pick your shots and try to understand the forces at work, how they're interacting with each other, where the state of, of foreign pressure is. I mean, you'll be able to kind of try to understand it in its broadest terms, and you're only half successful. I mean, I think that's the difficulty here.
As you look at the Middle East, over the next 2, 3, 4 years, do you anticipate that things will continue to be as tumultuous as they've been in the past year, or do you think they'll eventually settle down?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, it's definitely, Arab politics are no longer going to be boring. That's clear first and foremost. I don't think it's going to keep this pace. I mean, we think back to the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s. The repercussions of just one revolution on the region, the birth of Hezbollah, a war with Iraq that lasted 8 years, a radicalization of Shiite constituencies across the Gulf. That was one revolution. We're dealing with 3 revolutions right now in the Arab world that have actually succeeded in 3 other uprisings. The repercussions and reverberations of that alone are going to last us years, and we also have the potential of more of these turning into actual revolutions. So it's hard to imagine the pace itself of this year sustaining itself, but it's almost certain that we're going to have a very turbulent, tumultuous period of years ahead as this new order begins to be constructed.
And long term, you're optimistic?
I'm incredibly optimistic, and this comes from a person who's been incredibly pessimistic for about 10 years. So I have to say it's kind of a nice feeling to have. I do think the short and the medium term are going to be grim. I think they could be very violent, they could be very difficult, they could be very dangerous. But in the long term, I think we're looking towards something that's a far healthier order.
Great. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Shadid.
My pleasure.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible in part by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India program at UCF.